Thank you very much indeed, Myrtle. And of course, Myrtle has written extensively in women's history. She was telling me she'd been working mainly on the suffrage movement, the campaign for the vote, and this is another interest of hers. Our third speaker this evening is John Gray. Myrtle mentioned liberals involved in the civil rights movement, and John came from that kind of background. He'll tell you all about it. Became a chronicler, actually, of events during the civil rights campaign, and has his own fairly graphic memories of this period. So can I ask you to welcome former librarian at the Lynn Library, Mr. John.
Thanks very much. My goodness, I'm getting triggers here to go down memory lane after a couple of the things that have been already said. I remember the Easter 1966 commemoration, not because I went up the Falls Road, where O'Neill did not allow a public space. He had actually allowed the Flags and Emblems Act to pass, which meant that the flying of the tricolour was illegal, and the RUC, very much at the instigation of Paisley, were sent up the Falls Road to remove the tricolour. Well, I wasn't there, but where I was in the Ulster Hall at the rally that Paisley had opposing the commemoration of the 1916 Rising. It was not just in the Ulster Hall, because the crowd didn't fit into the Ulster Hall. It was the whole length of Bedford Street as well. And he spoke for 2 hours. Spoke is not quite the right word. Shone the mass with his arms dipped up to their elbows in English blood. I became something of an aficionado of Paisley's sermons. I used to go there and put Italian lira in the collection plate. But I think the most tremendous occasion, shortly after he got arrested for attacking the moderator of the Presbyterian General Assembly, was when, if you can imagine it, he summoned up on the platform, "Here I have the moderator of the Presbyterian General Assembly. And here I have the Lord Jesus Christ. And I say to the Lord Jesus Christ, what would you do with the moderator of the Presbyterian General Assembly?" And the Lord Jesus Christ says, "Push him off the stage." And that was a 2-hour performance too. I sort of came to these things from a strange background. My parents are English, came over just after the war. My father was a lecturer at Queen's University. Always anti-establishment, but never actually did anything about it. Liked to call himself a stateless person, which I always found rather unsatisfactory. And, you know, you need to understand that Queen's University at that time was a strange English cocoon. I suppose it was like any other colonial university. Could have been in Kampala or any African colony where to get your first academic appointment, you know, you took what was going. And that's essentially how my father ended up here. It was a cocoon. I don't think I've met, and this is middle-class Belfast, I don't think I met my first Catholic, and a very nice girl she was, until I was about 16. That's mainly because I was just dealing with English children. I, like my father, had a tendency to support lost causes and became sympathetic to the Liberal Party, and became the sole, or I think there was one other representative at Campbell College, where Samuel Beckett once said, the pupils were the cream of Ulster, rich and thick. I think that was a bit unfair. But let's put it like this. I do remember one occasion And it must have been about 1966 when, as already said, the whole debate about the EEC was going on. Well, myself and this other luckless individual were the only two individuals in the debating society who supported entry into the EEC. We were defeated by about 70 to 2, and the argument on the other side of the platform was that it would mean Rome rule. And I was reminded of this very recently, at the time of our recent referendum, because there's a huge mural in Tigers Bay, just below where we live in North Belfast, which says, "Vote no," and then there's a reference to the Book of Revelations. I digress. Being a member of the Ulster Liberal Party was really a case of being a member of an underground organisation. It still carried the taint of having supported Home Rule, the best part of 70 years earlier. You couldn't canvass in any normal sense in an area, not for very long you couldn't. You might do half a street and then run away before somebody caught up with you. There was the famous case of the Lisnaskey by-election in early 1968, where the leader of the Ulster Liberal Party advanced on Brookborough in County Fermanagh. He was a lovely guy. A non-subscribing Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Albert McElroy, who was well used to preaching to difficult congregations, since he advanced on the people of Brookborough with his arms wide open, I think saying something to the effect that my people, free trade will lower the price of salt, and the crowd rushed past him, overturned his car and burnt it. And that is the way politics here were. Now, I only really discovered that when I, like so many others, went to university in England and was very active in liberal politics, and was amazed to discover that the rather unimportant Liberal Party didn't get its cars overturned and burnt, that its members didn't have to meet in secret. I sort of discovered, well, British politics isn't perfect, but it was a hell of a sight more democratic than what was going on here. Very much an epiphany was, I was working in London, seeing on television the October the 5th demonstration and what happened then. And it just reminded me of my sense of it wasn't a case of the state of Denmark being rotten, it was a case of the state of Northern Ireland being rotten. I duly flew over to Northern Ireland to attend the second demonstration in Derry in November, when 15,000 people turned out. Bear in mind that first demonstration, you're talking about 700 or 800. A month later, it's 15,000 people. There is a tidal wave, an unstoppable tidal wave underway. And that's the way these things happen. And it's not only black Americans. It's May 1968. It's the opposition to the Vietnam War. I actually was at the famous Grosvenor Square demonstration in London, but as an observer. It was a bit like how I got involved in the PD. When I came over in November, well, where would I go? I went to Queen's, not knowing anybody, and discovered there was a Margaret bus, but it was full up. And then there was a revolutionary bus, which had lots of spare seats on it. So, for better or worse, I ended up on the revolutionary bus and actually stayed on it far longer than I should have done for my health, really effectively for the next 2 years. And you need to understand, you need to understand the incredible pace of events that Eamon McCann, I think quite rightly, sort of says, and give him his due, that Eamon McCann was involved long before '68 in all those campaigns over employment and housing in Derry. And of course, why did it all start in Derry? You know, Derry was the pustule on the face of Northern Ireland. In every which way, what was going on in Derry was criminal. But Eamon sort of says, you know, we never had time to stop and work out what the theory of all this, what the tactics were. The next event was upon us, and of course Burntollet was one of them. And I mean, people do go on about Burntollet. I mean, in a sense, it was just turning on Unionists on the Orange Order their own slogan, civil and religious liberty for all. You can march everywhere, why can we not march some places? Well, that was idealistic, to put it mildly, in terms of what happened. And in essence, it turned out as another disaster for Unionists. Again, it certainly reignited or remobilized the more militant strand in the civil rights movement, and I think perfectly justifiably. Much is made of St. Terence O'Neill. I just remind you of a quotation from Terence O'Neill just after he resigned. "It is frightfully hard to explain to Protestants that if you give Roman Catholics a good job and a good house, they will live like Protestants. They will refuse to have 18 children. But if a Roman Catholic is jobless and lives in the most ghastly hovel, he will rear 18 children on national assistance. If you treat Roman Catholics with due consideration and kindness, they will live like Protestants, in spite of the authoritative nature of their church." I mean, here is an unbelievably patronizing statement with regard to a third or more of the population of the province. A statement which also is redolent of the notion that the Protestant way of life is better and that Protestants are better. There is not a sniff of any genuine sense of equality in that statement. And so long as there was no equality, we were in a fix. Now, okay, it did all go downhill. I mean, the period of hope for change, hope for rapid change, really lasted until August '69 and the debacle in Belfast in August '69. The final kibosh came with the second and even bigger disaster of the introduction of internment without trial, which sent, I mean, those two episodes sent us down a road which no sane person would have wished to go. I had in fact left here early in, I think about mid-1970 with my wife-to-be, because we had despaired of the kind of progressive politics that the PD aimed for. There was little point in turning out to have rocks thrown at you, little point. And of course, one of the things that I think about this is, you know, one of the difficulties is if you're saying one man, one vote, but especially if you're saying fair shares of jobs and fair shares of houses, and actually if the economy isn't growing, somebody has to lose. You can't, if you look at it even rationally from a Protestant working class point of view, well, they might get a vote because they were excluded. The property vote business, excluded working class prods who didn't own their own houses. But when it came to jobs, if you were going to share out equally what was there, the meagre share of jobs that were available, and unemployment was rising, the old industries were collapsing, well, it implied somebody was going to lose, somebody was going to gain. If there was a shortage of housing, well, it certainly didn't justify the kind of appalling discrimination that went on, especially west of the ban, but it was going to be an area of acute competition. None of that justified 30 years of war, though I will say amongst the people who were totally confounded by, the developments, in particular August 69, were the Republican movement, as it then was, who were disciples of the stages theory, which argued that, first of all, you had to reform Stormont, and then, at another stage, you could actually get a progressive Stormont or some kind of revolution in the distant future. Well, in August 69, in West Belfast, the last thing people were thinking of doing was reforming Stormont, and hence the opening very much for the provisional breakaway. And too easily characterized as right-wing maniacs subsidized by the Blaney wing of the Free State government. It was more complicated than that. And of course, the provisionals had a later Marxist phase. So, revisionism goes on everywhere. But one thing I think we can safely say, and it doesn't matter where you come from, what your religious background or no religious background is, we contrived 30 years or more of catastrophe. I don't actually regret the part that I played, because I think that, as Margaret has said, change was going to be incredibly difficult. And in particular for unionism. And the pace, to my mind, had to be forced in one way or another. And I think at least we sought to put an idealistic and progressive and internationalist face on that. I've now ranted and raved for quite long enough.